And I know rail people don't like to hear this, but remember, we're competing against a whole range of other economic investment projects. We have to show our case. And this is where Gauteng is interesting, because Gauteng was never put forward as a transport project alone. It was put forward and proposed way back in 2003, 2004 as an economic investment and an economic growth project that would stimulate new development and job creation. The other elements, of course, were transport related, restructuring urban areas, city sustainability, and promoting public transport, promoting small businesses, tourism, etc. To give you some of the details about the project, it's a greenfield urban rapid rail project, 80 kilometers with 10 stations linking the 3 cities in Gauteng and the airport. It is a PPP. It's a concession agreement of the design, build, finance, operate, maintain, and transfer. And what's interesting, it's signed in 2006 and it ends in April 2026, which is only 2 years away. These are some images of it for those of you who have not seen it. It's a very modern, lovely system. It runs just under 7,000 trains per month, 10-minute headways in the peak, 20 minutes off-peak. It also has 125 buses, 11,000 parking bays, but its performance has been remarkable. 99% availability and 98% punctuality, with less than 0.4% fare evasion and almost no security incidents. 100% passenger safety record. So that's why Gauteng now, as a province, puts rail as the backbone of its public transport system. And it's seen transport-orientated development nodes coming up around all of the Gautrain stations, which you see the route in a map on the right. The current Gautrain is in solid red. Our planned extensions are in dotted red, and the PRASA Metro Rail network is in blue, dotted blue. And through building these systems, we have greener congestion, decreased environmental harm, had a massive economic impact, 20 billion rand during construction and 1.7 billion rand per annum during operations. Created around 11,000 direct jobs and 61,000 indirect jobs. And you'll see that as the population of our cities grows, this need for urban transportation, rail transportation grows stronger and stronger. Talking about the Gautrain as a PPP, we're one of the first passenger rail concessions ever in the world. I think we were 7th, if my memory serves right, when we signed the agreement in 2006. Capital cost around $3.5 billion, making it one of the largest greenfield PPP rail projects in the world. It's also very interesting because of its age. It's now completed its 5-year construction period up until 2011, 2012, and has 12 years of full operation. It's coming to the end of concession, and it's one of the very few PPP projects to go through the full life cycle of design, build, operate, and now the transfer stage. Transported, as I said, 200 million train and bus passengers to these fantastic service standards. But it's a very over 53 separate but interlinked contracts, as you can just imagine the complexity, to manage over 19.5 years of planning, construction, and operation. So the project preparation, the work that went into this was enormous. And it took a lot of collaboration between the province, the National Treasury, and the Department of Transport. We also, I can't say we anymore, I've left there now, but it is the first rail PPP project to reach reconcessioning in the world. So there's a very exciting phase of that which is happening. These are our partners. That's the provincial logo. The Gauteng provincial government signed a PPP agreement with Bombela. Bombela has the shareholders at the bottom, in the beginning international players, Bombardier and Bouygues, as well as local investors, and the operators from France are RATP Development. In terms of timelines, and I think if Tanzania is looking at PSP in a meaningful way, please start planning now, because these things take a long time. From the feasibility study in April 2000 to financial close was around 5.5, 6 years. Around 6 years to build. So in total, from start to ribbon cutting is 10 years. So we have to be thinking well ahead of the curve. And we're in the operations and maintenance phase now. Very importantly, I'll touch on it briefly. And again, it's crucial in developing countries. Rail projects must have targeted socioeconomic development. And in the Gautrain, we formalize this. We contract with Bombela, the private party, for 22 components of socioeconomic development. Things like job creation, who they buy materials from, a whole training, women employment, employment of people with disabilities, all of these socially important elements. As a result of that, over 6 billion rand, South African rands, have been invested in the last 10 years in South African goods and services that has boosted the rail supply chains. So this is great. So then when someone else goes out to tender, these supply chains have been built up, people have been trained, and there's expertise in the country. Over 131,000 jobs in construction and 12,000 jobs per year in operations. To then finish off, just to talk very quickly about what happens to Gautrain after the concession. The country is looking to reconcession this and looking at these elements, which I've got on the screen here, and increasing localization and supply development, promotion of tourism, to be a catalyst of economic development, growth and recovery, to contribute towards integration objectives so that Gautrain integrates with other transport modes, attracting new investment, increased affordability to users, so those who live in areas where access is difficult, there may be a different tariff, a different fare structure to increase affordability, to promote the image and use of public transport, and of course the investment in. I thank you all.
A couple of questions, quick rapid fire questions to you, and we'll let you take note of them and then quickly answer those, as we may not have you in the near future, in the next 1 or 2 hours, and so we'd like to make good use of you as an expert resource. Ladies and gentlemen, questions please.
Ni akibainisha ni kwa namna gani hapa nchini Tanzania wanaweza wakawekeza huko katika sekta hii adhimu ya usafirishaji sini, ambapo kwa maelezo yake ni kwamba kule kuna mafanikio makubwa sana. Tusikilize sasa baadhi ya maswali kutoka kwa washirika katika kongamano hili.
Freight trains. Yeah. William, did you hear that very well?
I've just, if I understood correctly, it's the question relates to the difference in concessioning passenger and freight lines. Is that correct? Difference. The common element is that you have infrastructure, rail infrastructure, and rolling stock, but the difference is in what you move and when. Scheduling, when freight gets moved, there's much more risk. So we in South Africa, and I didn't have time to mention this, in the reconcessioning of the Gautrain from a passenger rail point of view, will not seek to transfer demand risk to the private sector, whereas in the freight rail sector, there would most definitely be the transfer of any form of demand risk on the freight. The other interesting difference is that I don't think that in passenger rail concessioning we'll be able to move to a vertically separated system just yet. In other words, concessions would be for the per way as well as for rolling stock, station management, etc. They would be integrated concessions, whereas the most likely route that we would go on the freight One is that Transnet would typically remain the infrastructure manager, and the private sector concessionaires would be required to upgrade the revenue sources. As I'd said, passenger rail is a subsidized service, so there would most likely be an element of different subsidies coming together to
Let's look at the hands. We have a hand here, and I'll bring a mic to you. Karibu sana. Please then launch into your question.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Abubakar Ochaki. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, Uganda Railways Corporation. My question, sir, is one. We have seen concessions failing, railway concessions failing in East Africa. In Tanzania, its concession with the Indian rights failed within the first 2 or 3 years. In Kenya, it failed within the 10 years. In Uganda, it failed within the same period, 10 years. What is that special stuff have you done to have your concession successful in South Africa? But also through your experience in the industry, why do you think these concessions have failed in our setup? And maybe the last question is, what would be your personal or guidance? What is it, 1 or 2, 3 stuff that we have to do to have it right again? Thank you very much.
Yeah, that is, in Africa, love to do things collectively. We never contract a supplier. You look around, I think Ethiopia's purchased some Chinese rolling stock. We ourselves have some Chinese stuff. It's bits and pieces all over the place. And I think one of the reasons then that leads to failure in a concession environment is that we don't look at cross-border opportunities and growing the scale of these concessions to a point of view where maybe they become more commercially viable. That would be my first plea and response. The second is maybe I think that we tend to under-prepare our projects before they go to market. We rush them. We're always under this pressure, and that's why I was indicating these timelines. We have to be thinking 10 years ahead, and we have to invest in the project preparation and the advisors that we get. Competition. So I'll give you the Gauteng example. So we went out in 2004 to this massive international bidding process. You know, it was a real roadshow. We had the president, the premiers, all the ministers there. We invited each country to send their potential investors. And they all came to the bidding conference. But at the end of the day, when we opened the tender box, there were only two bids in the box. And I suspect, I don't know how true this is in those examples that you gave, I suspect that there wasn't strong competition in the market for these concessions. So one of the things that we should be addressing is, have we got our market conditions right? Or are we subject to very limited, uncompetitive bidding that might lead to contracts that are kind of set up for failure? But I think those would be, again, sort of the thoughts that come to my mind. It would be very interesting to, maybe before I, one topic which is really, really important as well is the amount of effort that goes into managing these concessions. You know, in South Africa, when we sign concession agreements, that transaction advisors leave, all the experts leave, and the government officials are left relatively junior managing this massively complex arrangement. We did not make that mistake on Gauteng. We set up this management agency. It has around 110 staff members, experts in rail, expert in law, expert in a range of things that work for the government. And that acts in the concession. So there's been many disputes in the Gauteng, many opportunities maybe for there to be some sort of a disaster and a term. We were a very strong contracting party on the public sector side. So I think that's a very concrete lesson learned that I can share from the Gautrain.
Okay, we have a bit of a feedback. So let's see if we can wrap up in about 5 minutes or so, as we're moving behind time. The next hand is Madam Chair.
Yeah, thank you, moderator. I'd like to have a question to Mr. William. According to your presentation, you have mentioned most of the,
Thank you for those. When Transnet, the passenger rail agency, the metro rail systems, as well as the long distance ones, but Transnet themselves were the people who owned the locomotives that would haul these long distance trains. And Prasa never focused on them properly. They would run some services, I think, inefficiently and overpriced, and they deliberately, I think, ignored the potential for private sector concessioning in that. In their defense, I think one of the complexities that there is that these long distance services run over both Prasa and Transnet rail lines at a time, and different traction power systems, at a time when Transnet itself hadn't figured out how to get open access sorted. One of the moves that we've got to have as a country now is how we reopen that up. And I must tell you, it's a very tough environment, because you'll know this, if you run any distance longer than sort of 500-600 kilometers, airlines tend to be more competitive. Anything less than that, you still need to be competing against private car and buses. So it's a very competitive market. I think we in South Africa should have taken the opportunity of introducing these concessions even some 20 years ago. We did not, and that is probably why South African investors are now looking towards Tanzania. What we are looking at quite aggressively, though, is in terms of a high-speed corridor. And our planning shows that between Johannesburg and Durban, there's a strong potential for a high-speed rail network. This is where we're talking in excess of 300 kilometers per hour top speed trains. Access approach would probably not work. You know, the hurdle to enter would be going and buying rolling stock that could run on a standard gauge system and not anywhere else in the country. The second reason is just in terms of the scale. So we've got 80 kilometers of network and 10 stations, and it doesn't make sense in this environment to have open access. The bigger plan, though, is to add in another 150 kilometers of standard gauge network across the province, and then an open access approach will probably work. And what we would do is we would concession out the infrastructure manager part, and then allow for operating licenses or operating concessions to operate on those lines.
The chat option within the app, it will also allow you to follow the proceedings. They may be able to engage with you further.
Wonderful. I look forward to that. Thank you.
And I understand that you still have about an hour with us, so if you're still there, you may hear some of the other speakers that are coming through before we go to lunch. But we'd like to thank you very much. Those hands were for you. Thank you for being a fantastic resource to this forum. Appreciate it. Asante sana. So, Honorable Minister, distinguished delegates, we have 30 minutes before lunch, and I had made a proposal to the organizing committee. Is my proposal agreed on? Do you think it's a good idea? I was proposing that we bring on the next two presenters, and then we go to lunch. So we're going to cut off the chunk of the Q&A or the plenary, so that we can have a bumper plenary after lunch. We have 4 presenters after lunch, and then we can all sit down. I'll set out the chairs for all the speakers to come forward, the DG and so forth, and then we can thrash our issues towards them. So quick back and forth, and it'll allow us to have a break before we go for the cocktail set out for you this evening. So it's an intensive day, but we also have a cocktail later, which allows you to also network and further build the business relationships. So if that proposal is good, let us go with the next 2 presentations. And then we're going to be on time as we were off time. We'll come back in time and then proceed with the next 4, and then just have a big plenary where we are discussing the issues together. All right, I think we might have a bit more strength after that.